In the dead of Christmas Eve, a blizzard screamed across the frozen valley like something alive. 8 figures moved in perfect silence, white on white, threading the narrow frozen creek bed between jagged ridgelines. No words passed between them, only the wind and the soft crush of snow beneath their boots. Then every light on the far ridge died at once, not dimmed by weather, switched off, deliberately, as if someone had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. Grenade arced out of the darkness from the left slope. The blast tore the night open. One body was hurled over the edge, tumbling down the ravine wall in a brutal spinning fall. Snow swallowed the impact. Bones broke. Steam rose from blood against the white. Above, boots scrambled. Voices cut through the storm. She's gone. A pause. Then the cold final order. Then we go. 14 footsteps faded into the blizzard. Down in the ravine, the fallen soldier lay face down in the snow, chest heaving. She did not call out. She did not scream. She only listened as her own team walked away. Then her gloved hand reached slowly into her left breast pocket. Not for a weapon. For something small. Something that had no place in war at all. She pressed it against her chest and began to climb. 2312 hours, Christmas Eve. Sergeant Elena Rourke would hear her team walk away. She didn't know that yet. Right now it was 6 hours earlier, and she was sitting on the edge of a gray wool bunk in a barracks that smelled of bleach and old coffee, and the particular metallic cold that gets into a building when the heat can't quite keep up with the weather. She was doing the only thing that ever made the hours before a mission bearable, checking her kit. Not because it needed checking. It never needed checking. She'd cleaned the rifle that morning. She'd counted the rounds twice already. She checked it now because the checking was the ritual. And the ritual was the anchor. And the anchor was what kept a person from thinking too hard about all the ways a thing could go wrong once they stepped outside the wire and into a dark that did not care whether they came back. So she laid it out on the blanket. Piece by piece, the Macmillan task, suppressed. Thermal optic calibrated 2 days ago by her own hands in this same room, under this same flickering fluorescent light. She ran a thumb along the stock the way you'd run a thumb along the spine of a book you'd read so many times you no longer needed the words. 10 rounds in the magazine, 1 chambered. She pressed each round with the pad of her finger, feeling for the seat of it, the way her first instructor had taught her. Your hands will know before your eyes do, he'd said. Train your hands. She'd trained her hands sidearm. 2 spare magazines, 1 grenade. Medical kit, contents memorized so completely she could find any of it in full dark with frozen fingers. And the flare she'd been carrying for 4 deployments without ever once using. She turned it over in her palm. Orange casing. Pull tab worn smooth, she thought, the way she always thought when she touched it, about the day she'd been issued it, at Fort Benning. 22 years old, sure of everything. You'll need it eventually, the instructor had told her. Sergeant First Class Dillard, a voice like gravel dragged over concrete, and a mustache that looked like something that had crawled onto his face and died there. Carry it like you believe that. The day you stop believing it is the day it stops being there when you reach for it. She'd carried it ever since. She set it in the vest pocket, buttoned the flap. Then she reached for the last thing, the small thing, the thing that wasn't kit. The thing that had no tactical function whatsoever and never would. The thing she always checked last, because checking it first would have felt like admitting it mattered more than the rifle. And she had spent 7 years learning not to admit, out loud or to herself, that anything mattered more than the rifle. A photograph 4 inches by 3. Black and white, the edges gone soft, almost felted, from years of being handled by hands that knew exactly how much pressure a thing could take before it tore. A woman in a nurse's uniform, standing in front of a canvas tent, somewhere in South Korea, 1952. The woman was 24 years old in the photograph. She was standing very straight. She was not smiling, because smiling was for people who weren't holding the weight of a field hospital on their shoulders. Behind her, you could see the corner of a stretcher and a stack of crates, and the kind of mud that gets into everything and never fully comes out. But the woman in front of the tent looked like she had decided, sometime before the shutter clicked, that the mud and the crates and the weight were not going to be the thing people saw when they looked at her. Her eyes were doing something. Not quite a smile, not quite defiance, something in between. Something steadier than either. Elena had spent her entire life trying to learn whatever that was. The woman's name was Ruth Rourke. She was 76 years old now. She lived in a white house in Asheville, North Carolina, with a porch that wrapped around 2 sides and a garden she tended in all weather with the same methodical patience she'd once applied to triage under mortar fire. 18 months in Busan. She had come home. She had raised a daughter who had raised Elena, and when the daughter, Elena's mother, had decided that a granddaughter who wanted to enlist was a granddaughter making the worst mistake of her life, it had been Ruth who drove 4 hours to the recruiting office to sit beside Elena in the waiting room. Ruth had never talked much about Busan. She had never needed to. Elena turned the photograph over 7 words. Her grandmother's handwriting, the letters sloped and certain. The ink had faded over the years to the color of a winter sky just before snow. The mission doesn't end until you come home, not come home safe, not come home soon, not the soft civilian version of the sentence that people said when they were frightened and wanted comfort and couldn't think of anything truer. Come home. Full stop. The rest was your job. Elena had been carrying those 7 words for 11 years. She'd carried them through Benning, through her first deployment, when she was so green she'd flinched at her own rifle, through the second, when she'd stopped flinching, through the night she'd made a shot that 2 grown men swore was impossible, and then asked very politely whether someone could verify the numbers, because surely the numbers were wrong. She'd had the photograph in her pocket that night too. She slid it into her left breast pocket now, buttoned the flap, pressed her palm flat against her chest for exactly 1 second. Not a prayer, she didn't pray, just a way of confirming that the thing was where it was supposed to be, that the anchor was still attached to the line. Then she picked up her rifle. And she went to the briefing. Captain Gideon Lark ran the briefing the way he ran everything, efficiently, precisely, with the particular confidence of a man who had never once, in Elena's 4 years of serving under him, appeared to doubt himself. 38 years old, face that looked carved rather than grown, all flat planes and clean angles, the kind of face that photographed well and gave away nothing. He spoke in clipped, declarative sentences, the speech of someone who had decided long ago that uncertainty was a resource to be managed rather than a feeling to be experienced. She had liked him once. That was the part she would have trouble explaining later to people who only knew the ending. She had liked him. She had respected him. There had been a time early in her second deployment when a senior CO had stood up in a room very much like this one and said that Lark was too cautious, too slow, too fond of the safe option. And Elena had stood up after him and said that caution was not the same as cowardice, that she had watched Lark bring 8 people home from a situation that should have cost at least 2, and that she would follow him into the next one without hesitation. She had believed every word of it. She would think about that moment a great deal in the weeks to come. The way you think about a door you walk through without looking, only to learn later what had been waiting on the other side. The mission was simple: reconnaissance, firebase Vostok, enemy installation approximately 11 miles northeast. Satellite imagery confirmed a mobile artillery unit operating from the site. Get eyes on the unit, confirm its position. Relay coordinates for an airstrike, extract clean. 4 hours, maximum. Elena sat in the 3rd row and listened. She noted the grid references. She noted the extraction point. She noted the patrol route. A long arc approaching Vostok from the southwest, riding a frozen creek bed as a concealment corridor. And she noted, for the 3rd time in 3 weeks, that something was wrong. She'd written the first report 22 days ago. She remembered the exact language because she'd chosen it carefully, the way she chose everything she put on paper. Primary source is single human. Unverified. No corroborating signals data. Recommend delay pending secondary confirmation. Filed. No response. Second report 9 days later. Southwest approach passes through a natural choke point at grid 447-229. If the enemy has any awareness of our operational patterns, this is the most predictable possible vector. Recommend alternate approach or modified timing. Filed. No response. Third report 4 days ago. She'd laid both concerns out together, and she'd added a third: anomalous radio traffic. She'd picked up on a frequency that had no business being active, a coalition frequency, internal, kind of thing that should only ever have been talking to itself. She'd flagged it and requested a meeting with Lark directly. He'd sent back 3 words through his aide. We proceed as planned. So here they were, proceeding as planned. Fine, she told herself, watching Lark's laser dot crawl across the satellite imagery. You've run missions with bad intel before. You've run missions where the route wasn't perfect and the timing wasn't yours to choose. You do the job you're given with the skills you have, the people you have. That's the work. That's all the work has ever been except, she kept looking at grid 447-229 on the map. That narrow place where the 2 ridge lines pinched together and the creek bed had no choice but to run straight through the middle of them. And she kept thinking about that frequency, and she kept not being able to make the unease go anywhere. It just sat in her chest, low and steady. The way a sound sits in a room after the thing that made it has already stopped. After the briefing, Lark stopped her at the door. "You filed another report," he said. "I did. You think I didn't read it. I think you read all three." A pause. Face did the carved thing. The small recalibration of a man choosing which version of patience to deploy. "Rourke, you're a sniper. The best shot in this battalion. Probably the best I've ever served with." He said it the way you'd say something to close a subject. A compliment built like a wall. "Let the planning be the planning. That's what I'm trying to do." "Then we're aligned." He smiled. It moved his mouth and nothing else. "We move at 22:17. He walked away. She watched him go. And she thought, not for the first time, but more sharply than usual, sharp enough that it almost surfaced into words, that she had been told to stay in her lane so many times, by so many people, in so many tones, she had begun to lose track of whether the lane was real, whether there had ever been a road at all, or whether someone had simply painted lines around her very carefully over a number of years and then told her the lines were for her own good. She let the thought go. She'd gotten good at letting that particular thought go. You had to. You couldn't carry it into the field. The field didn't have room for it. She had a mission. She went to get ready. They moved out at 217 hours, 8 soldiers. Full winter kit, white over gray. The camouflage that turned a person into an absence against snow. Thermal suppressors on every weapon. 11 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping, the air so dry and cold it had a taste. A thin mineral edge, like licking the back of a spoon. The sky was the particular opaque black of a sky that has already decided to become a blizzard before morning and is simply waiting for the right moment to commit. Elena walked third, behind Lark. Behind Corporal Seth Pruitt. Pruitt was 26, and built like a man who had spent his whole life being told he was too big for tight spaces, and had made a quiet career out of proving that theory wrong. He moved through terrain the way some people sing a low, unconscious efficiency. Every step, placed before it landed. Elena had noticed it on the first exercise they'd run together 2 years and 1 deployment ago, and she had respected it ever since. He didn't talk during movement. Neither did she. They had developed, over time, the comfortable communication of 2 people who understood each other well enough not to need words to fill the silence. He glanced back at her about 40 minutes in, when they were picking their way along the frozen creek bed and the wind had begun to pick up, throwing the first scouting flakes of the storm sideways across their path. She looked back at him. He raised one eyebrow. A fraction of an inch. A question with no military designation but a perfectly clear meaning. "Something feels wrong to you too?" She gave him smallest possible nod. He returned it, and that was the whole conversation. 2 soldiers in the dark, agreeing that the night had a shape they didn't like. Neither of them said it out loud. Out loud would have meant a decision, and the decision wasn't theirs. The decision belonged to the man walking point. The man who had read all 3 of her reports and answered them with 3 words. They kept moving. The choke point at grid 447-229 was exactly what the map had promised. A gap between 2 frozen ridgelines, narrowing to maybe 20 feet at its tightest. The creek bed ran straight through the center of it because there was nowhere else for the creek bed to go. Snow had drifted hard against the walls on both sides, packed by wax, then jigged into something nearer ice than snow. And above them, on the ridges, same wind had carved the formations into jagged, deliberate-looking shapes, shapes that had the unsettling quality of architecture, as if someone had designed the place to funnel anything that entered it into a single, undefended line. Elena had been looking at this place on a map for 3 weeks. She had described it in writing. She had recommended against it twice. Now she was standing 30 feet from the mouth of it, and that was when she saw the lights, the enemy patrol lights, off, not dimmed, not redirected, not flickering in the storm, off, completely, as if someone, somewhere on the far side of the choke point, had reached out and flipped a switch at a very specific moment and dropped the whole eastern approach into darkness. Patrol turns its lights down when the weather worsens. A patrol turns its lights off when it has somewhere better to be or when it has been told to make a place look emptier than it is. The thought arrived with the cold clarity of a fact that has just finished assembling itself out of pieces a person has been carrying for weeks without knowing they fit together. They turned the lights off before we got here. They're not reacting to us. They were waiting. Her mouth opened. The word contact was already forming, already moving from her chest toward her teeth. The grenade came from the left ridgeline. She never saw who threw it. The blast threw her 6 feet, maybe more. She was in no position to measure, given that she was airborne when it happened, and the landing was less a landing than a collision. Her body meeting the frozen wall of the ravine that dropped away below the ridgeline, then the slope, then the bottom. In 3 distinct impacts her nervous system would replay for her, individually, over the next several seconds. The sound she heard, somewhere in the middle of all that, was her left leg. It was not a sound she could have described to anyone who hadn't heard their own bones do something similar. It came from inside, a wet, structural crunch that her brain registered as information before it registered as pain, the way you see lightning before you hear thunder. Then she was at the bottom, face down, in the snow, and she lay still, not because she was unconscious. She was furiously, electrically conscious. She lay still because stillness was the first decision, the one before all the other decisions, the one her body had been trained to so many times that it made it now without consulting her. You don't move until you know the field, so she took inventory. From the bottom up, the way you do, left leg, broken. The angle was wrong. She could feel that without looking, the weight of it had redistributed itself in a way legs don't do when they're working. Femur probably. Maybe the tibia too. She would find out later. Later was a category she was already building, placed to put things she couldn't deal with in the next 5 minutes, rifle still on her back. The strap had held. She could feel the press of it across her spine, vest intact. Grenade, sidearm, medical kit, flare. She ran the inventory by the small pressures of each item against her ribs. All present Botfiskis against ice. So cold it had stopped burning and started doing the other thing, the numb thing. The thing that, in another context, on another night, she would have known to be afraid of. She was breathing, slowly, quietly, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way Dillard had drilled into her at 22, standing over her in the Georgia heat, while she gasped through a stress course and wanted to quit. Breathe like the breath is yours and nothing else is. Because sometimes the breath is all you'll have, and you'd better know how to spend it. She was breathing, and she was listening. Above her, on the ridge, voices. Rourke's down. That was Pruitt, 40 feet up and to the east, maybe less. And there was something in his voice that she cataloged without sentiment, because sentiment was a luxury and the field was not the place for it. Not grief, fear. He was afraid. I saw her go over the edge. The blast, Captain, she's gone, you sure? Lark, the voice from 100 briefings. Clipped, flat, the voice of a man doing math in his head. The calculating kind of math. Kind where a person stops being a person and becomes a variable in an equation about acceptable losses. I'm sure. We can't go back for her. Perimeter's collapsing. 3 more minutes and we're all in that ravine with her. A pause. She counted it. Counting was what she had. 1, 3, 4, then we go, Lark said, just like that. She heard the scramble of gear, the crunch of boots accelerating across packed snow. The sound of her team, the people she had eaten with and trained with and bled near for 2 years, moving north away into the storm 14 steps. She counted those 2, then nothing. She stayed perfectly still for a full minute after the last sound faded. Training, pure training, even as everything inside her. Everything that was 22-year-old Elena on the stress course. Everything that was the girl in the recruiting office with her grandmother beside her. Everything that was just a human being who had been left alone in the cold to die, wanted to scream, to call out, to demand they come back, to howl at the indifferent dark that she was alive, that she was right here, that all they had to do was look. The training held. And then, as she finally began the slow agony of getting an elbow under herself, she heard one more thing, Lark's voice. From a distance now, already moving away. A sentence pitched low and meant only for Pruitt, delivered with the easy, unguarded confidence of a man who believes he is among the living and speaking to the living, and that the dead, conveniently, are no longer in the conversation. She was getting reassigned anyway. Elena stopped moving. The cold pressed against her face. The wind moved through the ravine with a sound like something very large, very patient, breathing in the dark. Reassigned, the word landed in her chest and sat there, not like a stone. Stones are dead weight. This was alive. This was a small, cold animal that had been hiding under the floorboards of her career for years, and had just, in a single carelessly spoken sentence, shown her its face, because she had never been told. Because for 6 months, every time she had asked about the reconnaissance track she'd been recommended for 4 years ago, the answer had been the same. Every time she'd asked about the team lead slot that 2 separate commanders had told her, to her face, she was next in line for, the answer had been the same: not we need you where you are. The slot isn't available. Soon. soon, and the man delivering the answer. Every single time had been Larko, said something very quiet, very far back in her head. The voice you only hear when you're alone, when there's no one to perform for, when the truth has nowhere left to hide. Oh, there it is. She didn't have time to finish the thought. She filed it, under later. In the place that was getting crowded, because she had a leg to deal with. And a mission to deal with. And the largest item, the one she was deliberately not looking at directly. She had people somewhere 30 kilometers south who did not yet know that the artillery unit at firebase Vostok had a window. She was, as of approximately 90 seconds ago, the only person on the friendly side of this entire valley who did. She pulled herself up onto her elbows. Her jaw clenched so hard her teeth ached in their sockets. The pain had changed character. It wasn't sharp anymore. Sharp would have been better. Sharp was a knife, and you could locate a knife. This was deeper and wider, a deep, spreading wrongness. Something hot and heavy had been poured into the marrow of her bones and was now trying to find its way back out. She breathed through it, in through the nose, out through the mouth. She reached back, pulled the rifle around, checked the action with fingers that were only just beginning to stiffen. It cycled clean good. She counted what she had: 10 rounds, 1 grenade, sidearm, and 2 spare magazines, 1 flare, 4 deployments unused. What do I have? What do I need? What is the first step? She did not let herself do the other math, the big math, the survival math, which asked questions like, can a person with a femur fracture cross 2 miles of snow in a blizzard and live? Because that math produced an answer she didn't want, and an answer you don't want is just a way of talking yourself out of moving. She did the small math, the 5-minute math. The first step was getting out of the ravine. She used the rifle as a crutch. She hated it. Hated the stress it put on the barrel. Hated everything she'd ever been taught about treating a weapon like the precision instrument it was. But hating it was a luxury, and luxuries were for people whose options numbered more than 0, and her options numbered exactly 0. So she climbed arms. Right leg. Something that wasn't quite courage, and wasn't quite anger, but lived in the narrow country between them. The place a person goes when the only directions left are up and give up has simply stopped being a word they know. Every foot of elevation cost her. The snow's waist deep in places, loose and unpacked, and every time she found purchase the broken leg would shift, and the pain would crest so high and so white that for a second or two she would lose the ravine entirely, lose the dark, lose her own name, and float in a hot, bright nowhere until her vision came crawling back. She counted every second. Counting kept her focused. Counting kept her from listening to the small, cold animal in her chest. Counting kept her from hearing, on a loop, 2 words walking away into the storm. Then we go. 2 words. The most expensive 2 words anyone had ever spent on her life. She made it to the top in 11 minutes. She knew because she had counted every one of the 660 seconds. At the top, she pressed herself flat against a snow-covered boulder, chest heaving, and looked east. And there it was, firebase Vostok, 2 miles out. The glow of its lights smeared by the blizzard into a soft, steady halo above the snow. Not the harsh point lights of a temporary camp, but the diffuse glow of a permanent installation. Heating systems, fuel storage, a communications array. A place that intended to be there in the morning. She knew the layout the way she knew her grandmother's house. The corridors, the choke points, the blind spots. She had studied it for 3 days before the mission, leaning over the satellite imagery until her eyes ached, memorizing it the way she memorized everything that mattered. She had memorized it as a target. Now she looked at it as a destination. And she reached into her left breast pocket. The photograph was still there. Ruth Rourke, 1952, 24 years old. Standing very straight in front of a canvas tent in a country that had tried for 18 months to convince her she was somewhere she did not belong. Not smiling. Eyes doing that thing. Elena did not take it out. Her hands weren't steady enough and the wind would have taken it. She just pressed her gloved fingers against the buttoned flap, against the small stiffness underneath, and she read the 7 words in her memory. Where they had lived for 11 years. The mission doesn't end until you come home. Ruth had not written come home first. She had not written come home before anything else, before duty, before the people who need you, before the thing you swore you'd do. She had written come home. The rest was the job, and the job was not finished. Elena pressed the flap 1 more time. Then she let her hand drop, and she turned her body, inch by agonizing inch, till she was facing the lights, and she started moving toward them. 2 miles took 40 minutes, 40 minutes of crawling and half dragging, and using the terrain like a third limb. Every fold of ground, every drift, every frozen hump of brush, a thing to be measured and used and left behind. She stopped every 3 to 4 minutes to check her back trail and to listen to the dark, because a person who stops listening is a person who has decided they're already safe, and she had not decided that and did not intend to. The blizzard was her ally. That was the thing she kept returning to, the small mercy she kept turning over in her mind like a coin in a pocket. Visibility was down to 30 feet, maybe less in the gusts. The wind was loud enough to swallow almost any sound a careful person made, and in white over gray camo on a white landscape, moving slow and low, she was a ghost. She had always been a ghost. The men in her unit had sometimes meant that as a dismissal. Where'd Rourke come from? Didn't even see her. As if being unseen were a failure of presence rather than a discipline. As if the woman who turned up in places she wasn't supposed to be, who appeared in the scope and disappeared from the room, were somehow less real for being quiet. There had been a major 2 years ago who'd looked at her qualification scores. Scores that were not just good but historically good, scores that sat at the very top of a list that went back decades, and asked in front of 3 other officers whether someone had verified the numbers, whether the range equipment might be miscalibrated, whether in essence the most likely explanation for an exceptional woman was an error. She had verified the numbers, calmly, twice, on a fresh range, with a fresh spotter, with the major himself watching. The numbers had been the numbers. He had cleared his throat and said well and changed the subject. And she had understood, standing there, that even being right was not always enough. That sometimes you had to be right and then prove you were right, and then forgive the people who had needed the proof, and that the forgiving was the most expensive part, the part nobody warned you about. Right now, being a ghost was the most important thing about her. She was 200 meters from the outer perimeter when she first heard the sentries, 2 of them. Northeast corner of the fence line, she found their heat signatures through the thermal optic, 2 shapes, close together. Close together meant talking. Talking meant distracted. Distracted meant they were not doing their jobs. The sloppy, comfortable inattention of men who have decided that on Christmas Eve, in a blizzard, behind a fence in territory they consider theirs, nothing is coming. Nobody expected a ghost. She watched them for 4 minutes without moving. Long enough for the cold to find new places in her, long enough for the broken leg to stop being a leg and become a fact she was managing. Their pattern was lazy, no discipline, no structure. Stop, talk. One of them wanders 10 feet in some direction. The other stays put. They drift back together. The security of soldiers who have never been hunted and do not believe they ever will be. She settled the rifle. She chambered the suppressed round she already had ready. Just to feel the action seat clean, the wind picked up, a long, screaming gust across the open ground between her and the fence, and she took the first shot on the exhale, riding the gust, letting the storm carry the sound away into the dark where it belonged. Sentry on the left dropped without a word. The one on the right turned. Confused. Some animal part of his brain firing, some old instinct telling him the world had just changed in a way his eyes hadn't caught up to yet. In the half-second he stood there, processing, she put the second round through the base of his helmet, both down before either had taken a full step. 9 rounds. 1 grenade. She crossed the perimeter in a low crawl, the broken leg screaming the entire way, pressed herself flat against the inside of the fence, heart hammering, not from fear exactly, but from the particular intensity of being completely and irreversibly committed. There was no going back now. There had never, since 2 words in the snow, been any going back. She took stock. The layout matched the satellite imagery almost exactly, almost 2 differences. The first, a third vehicle, parked near the armory, that hadn't appeared in any of the reconnaissance photos. The second, portable communications array she hadn't anticipated, a dull cluster of antennas set against the east wall of the main building, running by the look of the cabling on its own independent power source, which meant backup, which meant that taking down the main lines wouldn't take down everything. She filed both, adjusted her mental map, kept it the way you keep a living thing, fed and current. She was moving toward the main communications building, low against the interior fence, when she heard it, the radio chatter, leaking out into the storm. She caught enough. Her Russian was limited, a few dozen words in a soldier's grammar, but military language has a structure all its own, skeleton you can read even when the flesh of it is missing. To understand the shape of what was being said, window confirmed 040. 30 kilometers south. She stopped 30 kilometers south, a coalition position. An artillery window at 040. She checked her watch. The face glowed dim and steady, .0108 hours, just over 3 hours. And here, pressed against a frozen wall inside an enemy firebase with 9 rounds and 1 grenade and a leg that was getting worse with every passing minute, she ran the only inventory that mattered now. She did not know if the airstrike coordinates had been transmitted before Lark pulled the team out. She did not know if anyone at the operations center was expecting a report from her unit. She did not know if anyone, anywhere, was looking for her, or whether she existed now only as a line in an after-action report that hadn't been written yet. She knew one thing: there were people, South, real ones, American and Allied, finishing watch rotations and brewing coffee and complaining about the cold, the way soldiers complain about the cold. Extensively, without real bitterness, because complaining about the cold means you're warm enough to still have opinions. People who had nothing to do with, who had left her in a ravine, and everything to do with who she was. And she was the only one who knew the window was coming. She pressed her back against the wall of the communications building. She did not take out the photograph. There was no time, and her hands were no longer reliable enough to trust with something the wind could steal. She just pressed her gloved knuckles once against her own chest, against the buttoned flap, against the small stiffness underneath. Then she turned toward the door, and as she turned, her eyes snagged on something through the building's narrow window, a radio board glowing inside. A row of frequency indicators, and one of them, one channel, lit and active, was not an outgoing enemy frequency at all. It was internal, coalition, a Fort Liberty frequency, a channel that should only ever have been talking to itself. On the other side of 11 miles of snow, inside the wire she had walked out of 6 hours ago, someone inside her own base's communication radius was talking to this firebase. Right now, in the middle of the night, she did not have time to process what that meant. She filed it. Hard, deliberate, the way you press a thumbnail into a page so you can find it again. The frequency, the number, the fact of it, she filed everything. That was the thing about Elena Rourke that her unit had never quite understood, that her commanding officers had only ever partly appreciated, and that the men inside Firebase Vostok were about to learn in the most expensive possible way. She did not survive first and think later. She thought, she filed. She moved. She did not stop moving, not for the cold, not for the leg, not for the small live animal in her chest that had finally shown her its face. Until the job was done, she reached for the door. She reached for the door, and the warmth hit her before her hand closed on the handle. It leaked out through the seam, a thin breath of heated air against the frozen skin of her wrist, and her whole body lurched toward it, the way a plant lurches toward a window. She caught herself. You don't walk into a building because it's warm. You walk into a building because you've decided to, on your own terms, with your weapon ready and your exits mapped. She went in through the side entrance, low and fast. There were 3 men inside, and she had watched them through the window for 40 seconds before she moved, so she already knew the geometry of the room. 2 operators at a long bank of equipment, backs to the door, faces lit pale blue by the glow of screens. A 3rd man, older 50s, standing over them, with the particular posture of a technical officer rather than a combat soldier. The posture of a man whose authority came from knowing things, not from doing them. The room smelled of hot electronics and instant coffee and cigarette smoke gone stale in the upholstery. The first operator was unconscious before he registered her presence. She came at him from behind and to the side, and the angle was clean. He simply stopped being a problem. The second spun in his chair. His mouth came open. She watched it happen, watched the breath gather for a shout, and she was already across the room, faster than her leg had any right to let her be, her forearm across his throat, pressure applied with the specific geometry she had drilled 1,000 times in a gym at Fort Benning with Dillard counting cadence over her shoulder. It's not strength, he used to say. Strength runs out. It's leverage. Leverage doesn't get tired. 12 seconds. Both down, not dead. She had chosen that. In the half-instant of decision, she had filed the reason away for later, because later was where everything went tonight that couldn't be examined in the moment. A dead operator was a body. A living one, restrained, was a witness who might one day matter. She didn't know yet how much that choice was going to be worth. She only knew that something in her had refused the easier option, and that she had learned, over 7 years, to trust the things in her that refused. Technical officer had backed against the far wall. Up close he was older than she'd guessed, 55 maybe. Gray at the temples. A face that had been handsome once and was now just tired. Not the tiredness of a long shift, but the deep, structural tiredness of a man who had been somewhere for too long, doing something he had stopped believing in. He was breathing hard. staring at her. And she could see him running the same calculation she had run at the bottom of the ravine, the only calculation any of them ever ran when the world came apart faster than they could account for it. What does this mean? What do I have? What is the first step? English, she said. It was not a question. He blinked. His accent was thick, the word careful. His name was Pyotr Malk. She would learn that later, the same way she learned the medic's name later. Because she made a habit of learning the names of the people who told her the truth. Good. She crossed to the map table without taking her eyes off him, the rifle held low and easy, every movement economical because economy was all she had left to spend. There was a topographical overlay on the table, weighted at the corners with spent shell casings. She didn't look at it yet. She looked at him. The window, she said. Tell me about the window. He said nothing. She let the silence sit. Silence was a tool. Most people couldn't stand it. They filled it, and what they filled it with was almost always something you wanted to hear. I walked through your entire perimeter, she said, when the silence had done its work and his eyes had begun to move, on a broken leg, in the dark. I am not having a good night, and I have very little of it left to spend. She let her weight settle, let him see that she wasn't going anywhere. She had nowhere to be that was more important than him. Don't test my patience. It's the only thing about me that's in short supply tonight. Malk looked at her, really looked, and she watched the precise moment he decided she was serious, not threatening. Not performing, not bluffing in the way frightened people bluff, but simply, entirely serious. A person stating facts about the immediate future. And she watched the moment after that, when he made his calculation and arrived at the only answer the calculation allowed. Artillery strike, he said. Coalition position 30 kilometers south. Window at 0430. She checked her watch. 019 hours, just over 3 hours. She nodded once and turned to the equipment. She worked fast. Fingers moving over the dials and the keying mechanism, reading the labels she could read, and inferring the ones she couldn't from the shape of the equipment, which was old and Soviet pattern, and not so different from systems she'd trained against in a cold room in Alaska 2 winters ago. The coalition frequency was there. She found it in under 2 minutes. The signal strength was poor. The blizzard was throwing interference across everything, but it was enough, barely. But enough was a word that meant something to her tonight that it had never quite meant before. She keyed the transmit button, and she started talking coordinates, timeline. The grid reference for the artillery unit, drawn from the overlay on the table behind her, which she'd taken in at a glance and burned into memory the way she burned everything. Call sign, ghost far to the south in a coalition operations center where a duty officer was 3 hours into a quiet overnight shift and thinking, probably, about coffee and the end of his watch. A radio crackled to life with a voice he did not recognize. Female, controlled, precise. Giving coordinates, giving a timeline, giving a grid reference for an artillery unit that was 2 hours from firing on a position that had been considered safe. He sat up straight. He asked for verification. The voice on the radio said, "The verification is that I'm still here. Write it down." "I'll wait." There was a pause on the far end, a long one. She could picture him. Could picture the exact face of duty officers when a transmission breaks every protocol he knows and is, somehow, more credible for it. He wrote it down. She released the button. Checked the watch. 0134. She looked at Malk. He was still against the wall, watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read, and she found herself in the small space between tasks, wanting to read it, wanting to understand why a man who had every reason to scream for help, every reason to lunge for a weapon or a door, was instead standing very still and watching her work as if she were weather. As if she were something that happened, rather than someone you fought. "Why are you helping me?" she said, not really asking. Filling the silence the way she'd let him fill it, he was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his careful English came slower, as if he were translating not just the words but the thing underneath them. "You are going to win," he said. "You don't know that." "I have been in this place 11 months, Malk said. "I have watched many men decide they are going to win. I know the look. It is a loud look. It shouts and it points and it is gone by morning." He tipped his head, the smallest gesture. The leg, the rifle, the blood at her temple she hadn't known was there. "You do not have that look. You have the other one. The quiet one. I have only seen it twice." A pause. Both times the quiet one was right. She held his gaze for a second longer than the mission allowed. "Sit down," she said. "Stay quiet." She pulled the chair from the second operator's station, checked his restraint, and turned for the door. Then she went back out into the storm. She had work to do, and the warmth had been a lie, and the cold was waiting for her the way it had been waiting all night. Patient, enormous, indifferent, and it took her again the moment she stepped through the door. Not gradually, aggressively, as if the few minutes inside had been a truce, and now the terms were off. She moved through firebase Vostok, the way water moves through a pipe, following the path of least resistance, always flowing, never stopping in a corner where a corner could close on her. The blizzard had driven the garrison indoors, and what patrols remained were minimal and miserable, men with their heads down and their collars up, walking the shortest possible routes between one heated building and the next. They were not looking for a ghost. They were looking for the door first, the armory. Always the armory. She had a rule about that, an old one, drilled in by the same tactics instructor who had given her the line she'd never been able to shake. You take away their weapons before you take away their voices. A man with a rifle and no radio is still dangerous. A man with a radio and no rifle is just someone calling for help that isn't going to arrive in time. She counted 4 sentries between her and the armory door, and she spent 12 precious minutes watching their patterns before she moved. 12 minutes in which her leg felt like it was being slowly disassembled from the inside, each minute a small negotiation between her body and the part of her that had decided the negotiations were over. She took 3 of the 4 with shots spaced carefully enough that none of them heard the others fall. A whisper, a gust, a whisper, storm carrying each sound away before it could mean anything to anyone. The 4th she had to take by hand, because the angle was wrong and the risk of a missed shot was a risk she couldn't afford with her count running down. She got close without him seeing her, used the butt of her sidearm, fast and precise. The way they drilled it, he went down hard, but quiet. 8 rounds left. 1 grenade. The armory door was secured with a standard Soviet pattern padlock, a model she'd trained against twice, once on a course, once in a cold building in Alaska where a master breacher had timed her until she stopped being slow. She had it open in 90 seconds with a pick she kept in her boot, a habit Dillard had called paranoid and that she now thought of as prophetic. Carry it like you believe you'll need it. She had believed. She had needed. Inside, she moved fast and methodical, and the cold logic of the next half hour assembled itself in her mind as she went. She left 3 things behind that had not been there before. A tripwire, drawn taut and low behind the primary ammunition cache, connected to a white phosphorus grenade she'd found racked beside the standard frags. She'd rigged it with a remote detonator, standard issue, because she always rigged things with remote detonators, because the first demolitions instructor she'd ever had used to say the best bomb is the one you can set off from somewhere else, when you choose, where you choose. A severed fuel line on the vehicle parked inside. The 3rd vehicle, the one that hadn't been in the photographs, which she filed even as she compromised it, and a complete mental map of the room's load-bearing structures, the exact geometry of how much fire it would take and where to bring the whole thing down. She wasn't going to pull the thread yet. You don't blow an armory if you want to control the aftermath. She remembered her instructor saying, his voice like gravel, his mustache like something a cat had left on the porch. You blow it if you want to make a statement. So make sure the statement is the right one, and make sure it's the right time. Because you only get to make it once. She was going to make a statement. She was just going to wait until the moment chose itself. Then, the motor pool. 200 meters east. 12 vehicles under a corrugated metal roof that was groaning softly and continuously under the accumulated weight of the snow, a low metallic protest, like a long exhausted breath that didn't quite end. A mix of troop transports and 2 armored personnel carriers, all parked nose in, all dusted white. She went to the fuel line on the nearest transport first, confirmed it was the same model she'd trained on during a vehicle interdiction course in Germany 2 years ago. The same access panel, the same routing, her hands knowing the work before her eyes confirmed it. 90 seconds on the fuel system, then the 2nd vehicle, then the 4th. Not all of them. There wasn't time, and time was the only thing she was truly short of. She was building a chain, sequence. When the right heat source was introduced at the right moment, this motor pool was going to solve several problems at once. It was going to draw eyes and draw bodies, and add its voice to a chorus she was composing, one compromised fuel line at a time. She was on the 4th vehicle when she heard the shout, a single sharp voice from the direction of the communications building. The kind of voice that doesn't yet know it's already too late and is trying, through sheer volume, to will the world back into the shape it had 10 minutes ago. One of the operators she'd left unconscious had come around. She'd expected it. She'd been more conservative than lethal in that room. and she'd known, even as she made the choice, the clock was running on it. Listened. The shout was followed by more voices, and then by the distinct sound of boots hitting frozen ground at speed. 3 men, maybe 4, converging on the communications building. The base was waking up. Not all at once. Not yet. But the first nerve had fired, and the body it belonged to was beginning slowly to understand that something was wrong inside its own walls. She finished the 4th vehicle in 45 seconds. Did the arithmetic without sentiment. 4 compromised, 8 operational, an acceptable ratio, and moved because there was a thing she'd heard earlier on the radio on a second frequency. Sharper than the first, more urgent, and in it she had caught one word, clear through the static and her own limited Russian, a word that had changed the texture of the whole night window, Agon, but the time notation that had followed it had not sounded the same. She didn't have enough Russian to be sure, and not sure was not a foundation you built a strike timeline on. Not sure got people killed, the people 30 kilometers south who were trusting, without knowing they were trusting, that the woman inside the firebase had her facts straight. She needed the operations center. She needed to see the map. She started for the command building. The command building was warmer than the communications building, and the warmth, this time, was a wall she walked into. It hit her in the chest and the face and made her body suddenly, riotously aware of every single degree of cold it had been carrying and ignoring for hours. The cold in her fingers, the cold in her feet, cold that had set up somewhere deep behind her sternum and meant to stay. Her knees went soft, her vision swam at the edges. For 1 second she was not a soldier inside an enemy command post. She was a body, and the body was failing, and the failure was very close. She planted her right foot, redistributed her weight onto the leg that still worked, and she kept moving, because the alternative, stopping, sitting, letting the warmth do what warmth does to a body that's been pushed past its limits, was a kind of death dressed up as relief, and she had not climbed out of a ravine to be undone by central heating. The interior was a single long corridor. 4 doors on the left, 2 on the right. She had studied this. Operations center at the far end, commander's office, 2nd door on the right. Briefing room adjacent. She needed the operations center first, not the commander. Not Drav, not yet. You don't move on the man who drew the map until you've read the map yourself. You read it first, in full, so that when you finally face him you already know more than he thinks you know, and the gap between what he thinks and what's true is the only weapon that never runs out of rounds. The operations center door was partially open. She approached from the side, took 1 breath, in through the nose, out through the mouth, and went in fast. 3 men, 1 at the map table, 2 at communications terminals. All 3 turned at once. The man at the map table was a major. She clocked the insignia in the first quarter second and the rest of him in the second. The way he moved with the instinctive authority of someone who had spent years expecting to be obeyed, his hand already traveling toward the sidearm at his hip as he turned, the motion smooth and trained and a half-beat too slow. "Don't," she said in Russian. One of the 12 words she knew well enough to use under pressure, and something in her voice, not the volume, there was no volume, but the flatness of it, the absolute and total absence of doubt, stopped his hand before it reached the holster. The 2 operators at the terminals looked at each other. Neither of them moved. In a room with 3 armed men and 1 wounded woman, the math had already been decided, and they could all feel it, even if only she could have explained why. She crossed to the map table in 3 uneven steps. Her Russian was limited. But military maps have a universal grammar, a language older than any of the ones people argue about. She read it fast. Grid lines, unit markers, timing notations. A red arrow pointing south-southwest, fat and confident. She found the timing notation on the artillery position marker. She read the number, not 0430. 15 minutes earlier than the window Malk had given her. 15 minutes earlier than the timeline she had transmitted south. The coordinates she'd sent, the margin she'd calculated, the whole careful structure she'd built in a freezing communications shack 20 minutes ago. Already 15 minutes wrong. She looked up at the major. "Who at Coalition Command knows the new timeline?" she said. He said nothing. She looked at him. She let him see that she had all night, even though she didn't, because the most dangerous thing you can do to a man who's calculating is to behave as though the clock is not your problem. "No one," he said finally. And there was something in how he said it. Not triumphant, not a taunt, just flat and factual and a little weary, that hit her harder than any threat could have. No one. The duty officer she'd reached had the original window. People south were operating on a clock that had already changed beneath them, and they didn't know. and there was no reason on earth they should, because the only person who knew was a woman they thought was dead, standing in a room that was about to stop existing. She turned back to the terminals. She got on the radio. Getting back through to the coalition duty officer took 4 minutes. 4 minutes of frequency interference and a handoff between watch officers at the top of the hour, 30 seconds of her repeating her call sign and authentication to someone who clearly hadn't been briefed on the first transmission. When she finally reached a voice that recognized her, she gave the update in 15 words. Window moved to 04015. Repeat 0415. Artillery unit is hot. Strike authorization needed now. The voice on the other end asked for a 12-digit verification code. She didn't have a 12-digit verification code. She was a sergeant, a sniper, not a strike controller. Nobody had given her a code because nobody, not in any planning room, not in any contingency, not in the most pessimistic version of this mission anyone had bothered to imagine, had planned for the scenario where she was the only American inside the firebase making the call. "I don't have the code," she said. And then, before the voice could retreat into protocol, she gave it everything, fast and level, the words coming out in a single line because there was no time for sentences. "I'm Sergeant Elena Rourke. Call sign Ghost, 3rd Battalion, and I am inside Firebase Vostok right now, telling you that 30 kilometers south of my position, there are coalition forces who have under 3 hours before they get hit by an artillery strike they don't know is Lupa. You can spend that time verifying me, or you can make a phone call south. Your choice. But make it now. Silence on the line then. Stand by, Ghost." She stood by. 44 seconds. She counted them. The major watched her from the map table the entire time, and she watched him back, and neither of them moved. Two professionals on opposite sides of the same problem, waiting together for a voice on a radio to decide how the next part went. "Ghost, we have visual confirmation on your grid. Strike package is being assembled. ETA to effect, 22 minutes. She did the math while the major watched. The gun fired at 4-1. The package arrived 22 minutes from her last transmission, call it 0403. A 12-minute margin, razor thin, closer than she would ever have chosen and infinitely better than nothing, which had been her only other option. "Copy," she said. "One additional item. Firebase Vostok command structure is active. I am currently inside the operations center. Recommend you flag my position due. Not strike until I tran all clear." "Understood, Ghost. Can you hold your position?" She looked at the door. She looked at the major. At the two operators. At a room full of people who, the moment the radio went quiet, would begin doing the arithmetic of how to kill her. "Negative on holding position," she said. "I'll be mobile." She signed off. Detached the transmitter from the terminal, taking it with her because it had something on it, 14 months of something, and she'd learned to take the things people didn't want her to have. She flagged her own position as a friendly marker on the tactical display, in case anyone south was looking. Then she went out the south window. 4 feet down onto packed snow, landing on her right leg first and nearly going down anyway when the impact telegraphed up through her whole body and found the broken places and lit them all at once. She caught herself on the exterior wall. She stood. She moved west, because there was one thing left to do before the strike package arrived. One thing the radio couldn't do for her. One thing that required her to find a specific man in a burning night and stand close enough to him to look him in the eyes. Flexi Drav had moved the window once already, over the radio. And a man who moves a window once is a man who might move it again. And a man like Drav, 2 tours and 1 decoration and 1 incident report that had been quietly resolved in his favor, was exactly the kind of man who did not trust systems he hadn't personally designed. She needed to find him. And she needed his voice. Drav's private quarters were in the northwest corner of the command building. She'd seen the notation on the operational map, a small room set apart adjacent to the briefing suite, kind of arrangement that said this man considers himself the center of gravity of this entire operation, the kind of man who draws the map with himself at the middle of it. She came around the northwest corner and stopped. The door was open, not ajar. Open, fully, deliberately. The way a door gets left when someone has just walked out of it in a hurry and decided that closing it behind them is no longer a thing that matters. She swept the room in 3 seconds. Empty. A lamp knocked sideways on the desk, still burning, casting its light at a long, low angle across the floor and up one wall. A tactical radio. A glass, half drunk, of something amber. And on the desk, a handwritten note on military stationery. She crossed to it. She read the time notation at the top. 4 digits. She already knew about 415. but below it was a second line in the same hand, and the ink was different, darker, fresher, written later. And the first number had a single clean line drawn through it. The new notation read 0403. He had not moved the window twice. He had moved it 3 times. The artillery unit was not firing at 0415. It was firing at 0403, and he had done it here, on paper, off the radio network, entirely, in handwriting that would never appear in any intercept, any signal log, any of the channels she'd been counting on. She checked her watch. 0211 hours, the strike package had assembled inbound ETA 22 minutes from her last transmission, would arrive at 4:03. The gun fired at 043 the same minute, except the gun fired first. She stood in that room for exactly 3 seconds, and the arithmetic of it was perfect and terrible. The strike would land on a position the gun had already fired from. The shells would already be in the air, already arcing toward 41 people who thought they were safe, by the time the package found nothing but an empty firing point and a crew that had melted into the dark. She picked up Drav's radio, keyed the coalition frequency, and she started moving as she talked, because she was not built for standing still, and standing still had stopped being available to her sometime around the moment 14 footsteps walked away. Ghost to control. Timeline change. Repeat, timeline change. Target fires at 0403. You are short. Talk to me. She went back out into the storm. The response came 40 seconds later. 40 seconds in which she covered 60 meters through wind and snow, and the rising noise of a base that was no longer asleep, evicting every worst-case scenario that tried to take up residence in her mind by the simple discipline of counting her own steps. Ghost, we cannot advance the package. 12-minute gap confirmed. Can you delay the artillery unit's ability to fire? She almost laughed. She was inside a fully waking enemy firebase, alone, with a broken leg and 8 rounds, being asked whether she could reach an artillery unit positioned outside the perimeter and delay its fire by 12 minutes. She looked at what she had. She looked at the armory building, 50 meters to her east. She looked at the fuel depot, 30 meters downwind of it. She looked at the remote detonator clipped to her vest, keyed to the tripwire she'd left behind the ammunition cache. She thought about human nature, which was the one thing she was almost always right about. People do not fire artillery when they believe the base they are supporting is on fire. They pause. They radio in. They wait for orders that don't come, because the men who give the orders are busy not being on fire. A burning base buys time the way nothing else buys time, because fear of friendly catastrophe overrides almost every other instinct a soldier has. 12 minutes. Maybe exactly 12 minutes. She was right. Define delay, she said. Disruption. Confusion. Anything that buys 12 minutes. She checked her watch. 0211 hours. 52 minutes until 0403. She keyed the detonator. The armory came apart in a flash that turned the blizzard, for one impossible instant, into daylight. The light flooded the compound, threw every shadow into hard relief, and was gone, replaced by a roar that was less a sound than a pressure, a deep continuous tearing that she felt in her teeth and her chest and the broken bones of her leg. And somewhere outside the perimeter, next to an artillery piece with a loaded breech and a firing order that was 90 seconds from execution, a crew chief grabbed his radio and started screaming for his commander to tell him what in God's name was happening inside the base. The gun did not fire at 0403. She pressed herself against the nearest wall and watched the fire climb, watched the secondary explosions begin to cascade through the motor pool as the compromised fuel lines did what she had designed them to do, one then another, irregular percussion adding itself to the roar. The base was chaos now. Real chaos. Not the manageable confusion of an alert, but the deep structural disorder of a facility that is coming apart and has begun to understand it. She found a position with a clear sightline to the main gate, and she waited because Drav was somewhere in this compound, and a man like Drav, when his base began to burn, did one of exactly 2 things. He fought or he ran. And she had read enough of his record to know which one. Men like Drav did not fight fires. Men like Drav made an assessment, decided the loss was acceptable. She waited. The fire climbed, the seconds ticked, and at 0218, 6 minutes into the 7 she'd bought, a figure appeared at the main gate, moving fast. 2 bodyguards flanking him in tight professional spacing, not garrison soldiers, these, but personal security, trained for exactly this, trained to put their bodies between their principal and whatever was coming out of the dark. A tactical bag over one shoulder. And that walk, that particular stride of a man who believes the space he occupies belongs to him by right. She recognized the walk before she recognized the face. She had seen it in senior officers. She had seen it in the major who'd asked whether someone had verified her scores. It was the walk of absolute assumption, the gait of a person who has never seriously entertained the possibility that consequences might one day apply to him too. Drav was running. She raised her rifle 8 rounds. Clear line. Wind from the northwest at maybe 12 kilometers an hour, negligible drift at this range. 1 round, center mass, and Colonel Alexei Drav would stop being a problem that required a solution. She did not take the shot. Not because she couldn't, because she needed him for exactly the next minute. The crew chief had stood down, but a stand down was a pause, not an ending. Eventually the crew chief would get an order, or make a decision, and the only order she could trust to hold them was an order in Drav's own voice, with Drav's own authentication code, on a frequency the crew would recognize and obey, which meant she needed him alive. And cooperative, the 2 bodyguards were the problem. Tight spacing, professional movement. The moment she fired on Drav, they would scatter into cover and she would have two armed, alert, trained operators hunting her through a burning base with 7 rounds left. That math didn't work. She needed a better angle. She needed them separated. She circled wide, using the burning armory as both cover and distraction. Every eye in the compound was pulled toward the fire, and the firelight narrowed a man's focus to the immediate and the bright, leaving the dark at the edges to her. She moved in that dark, fast and low, eating the pain because the alternative was standing still, and standing still wasn't in her anymore. She cut the angle from 230 meters to 90 in 40 seconds. At 90, with the gate in full view, she stopped and reassessed. The vehicle beyond the gate was running, exhaust pluming white in the cold, which meant a driver, which meant a 4th person she hadn't fully accounted for, sitting warm and waiting for a man who had decided the firebase was now someone else's problem. Drav was 30 meters from the gate, 1 bodyguard tight on his left. The second guard had dropped 4 steps back and turned, scanning the compound behind them, covering the rear. She waited. The rear guard turned back toward the gate. For exactly 3 seconds, his sight line was away from Drav. She put a round through the radio on his hip, not through him, through the radio. A target the size of a paperback at 90 meters, poor light and wind off a broken leg. She made it look like a function, because to her it was. She had been making targets like that look like functions her entire career, and the only people who were ever surprised were the ones who'd asked whether someone could verify the numbers. The radio exploded off his belt. He spun, dropping to 1 knee, a sharp, involuntary sound torn out of him. And in the half-second of confusion that followed, the bodyguard on Drav's left turning toward the sound, Drav himself flinching and breaking stride, she was already moving. Out of the dark, at a dead run from his left flank, covering the last 20 meters faster than her leg had any business allowing. She hit the remaining bodyguard from the side before he could reorient, drove both of them into the fence. The fence groaned and gave. Her legs sent up a signal so loud and so absolute that for 1 terrible second her vision went gray, and she was back in the ravine, face down, everything broken, everything beginning. She held. She came back. The bodyguard went down. She was already turning. Drav had his sidearm up, 8 feet away. Close enough that she could see his face clearly for the first time. Older than his file photos, harder, with a particular flatness around the eyes of a man who had done difficult things and made his peace with them long ago. His hand was steady. He was not a man who shook. "Drop it," he said. In English, clear, barely accented, better English than she'd expected. She didn't drop it. She didn't raise it either. She held the rifle at a 45-degree angle, not pointing at him, not pointing away. A position that said, "I'm not finished, but I'm listening." 8 feet. At 8 feet, this was not a firefight. At 8 feet, a man with his training did not need to think. The decision and the shot would be nearly simultaneous. At 8 feet, this was a conversation. "You're the woman from the ravine," he said. It was not a question. Yes, something moved across his face. Not respect. More like the recalibration of a man who had made an assessment hours ago and was now auditing his own methodology in real time, line by line, and not liking the results. "You called, in our position, yes. And the strike package lands in about 14 minutes. She kept her voice level, kept it in the register of someone reading a weather report. "Your artillery hasn't, because your base is on fire, and your crew chief is confused, which means the people 30 kilometers south are still alive, which means your window is closing." His jaw tightened, and then he did the thing she had not anticipated. He lowered the sidearm 2 inches, and he kicked her, hard and precise, directly in the broken leg. The pain was not the pain she'd been managing all night. That pain had been a long argument, a thing she'd been talking down for hours. This was a verdict, The whole leg, all at once, every fractured surface announcing itself simultaneously at the absolute top of its register. She went down, one knee in the snow, rifle still in her hands, vision strobing white at the edges. Well, said some absolutely inappropriate corner of her mind, the part that narrated her own disasters in the dry voice of a woman watching them happen to someone else. That happened. Drav was on her in a second, the sidearm against her left temple. She could feel the cold ring of the muzzle, the particular stillness of a man who has done this before and is not performing it for anyone. The transmitter, he said quietly, the one you took from the operations center. You will give it to me. Oh, right, that think 3 rounds, 1 grenade, gun to your head, 14 minutes. Think. There's a version of this where you live. There's always a version. Find it. 9 minutes, she said. Her voice was level, completely, entirely level, which was a kind of miracle because she did not feel level. She felt like a structure that had been hit by several large things in quick succession and was conducting an emergency assessment of its own foundations. But her voice held. Her voice had always held. It was the last thing to go and the first thing she'd learned to protect. 9 minutes. Everything north of this fence. You, me, both of us. The vehicle outside the gate, the driver in it, every man still standing in this compound. She did not look at the gun. She looked at his eyes. Or you give the order. Your authentication code, primary frequency, voice confirmation, no ambiguity. And you walk out that gate and you get in that vehicle and you go wherever people like you go when they lose. He held the gun against her temple. He was thinking. She could see it, the rapid interior arithmetic of a man who has just run out of the version of the situation where he wins outright and is now sorting fast through what remains. And the transmitter, he said, stays with me. Then I shoot you and take it. Then you get a transmitter with no code. The encryption resets every 4 hours if I don't authorize it. It was not true. She watched his face to see if he knew it wasn't true. He didn't. And you have 8 minutes. Pause, 4 seconds, 5. His jaw moved once. Then he took the gun from her slowly, deliberately. The gesture of a man who has not surrendered but has stopped advancing. He reached into his jacket and produced a small tactical radio. Looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man holding something he had believed all his life was a weapon and had just discovered was something else. Then he raised it. Artillery 1. This is Vostok Actual. Authentication Delta 7 Kilo. Stand down. Stand down. Do not fire. Static. 3 seconds. Then a Volthisar outside the remitter, confused and relieved in equal measure. Vostok Actual. Artillery 1 copies. Standing down, awaiting further orders, he lowered the radio. She exhaled, one slow, controlled breath, and the thing that had been wound so tight in her chest since then we go loosened, exactly 1 degree. 1 degree, the job wasn't finished, but it had moved. Gate, she said. Walk to it. Get in the vehicle. Go. He looked at her one more time in the firelight with the blizzard driving snow between them and the base burning behind her. Your people left you here, he said. Yes, and you still fought. She thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved, which was not long. Because she had answered this question privately at the bottom of a ravine, in the silence after 14 footsteps faded. I didn't fight for them, she said. I fought because the mission wasn't finished. He was quiet for 1 full second. Then he turned, and he walked through the gate, and she watched the vehicle pull away into the dark and the snow until it was gone. 0226 hours. 4 minutes, she turned back toward the base. And here was the problem she had been deliberately not thinking about, because thinking about it would have been counterproductive, and counterproductive was a luxury. She was still inside it. The coalition strike package was 4 minutes out. Her position marker was in the system. But do not strike markers had margins, and margins had limits, and the kind of ordnance being directed at firebase Vostok was not the kind that respected tight margins. It was the kind that converted structures into geology and asked questions afterward, if at all. She needed distance, 200 meters of it, in 4 minutes, on a leg that had just been kicked, with surgical precision, by a man trained to do maximum damage with minimum effort. She went back through the gate and turned south, moving along the exterior fence line, using the fence itself as a partial windbreak. The storm was still full force, still her friend, and the garrison that remained was occupied with the fire and its own survival, not with her. The radio crackled. Ghost, we have you at current position. Strike in 3 minutes. Confirm you are clear of target area. Negative, she said, still moving. Working on it, Ghost. We need you clear. Can you? I said, I'm working on it. She cut him off. Not rudely, just with the absolute economy of a person who had no bandwidth left for any words that weren't about the next 10 feet. Talk to me in 2 minutes. She pushed harder. Her right leg was doing nearly all the work now. The left had become a thing she dragged, a fact she negotiated with at every step. The combination of pain and cold and the slow accumulated toll of 6 hours of physical assault was trying to convince her body that her legs were theoretical. A suggestion, an opinion, nothing she was obligated to honor. She told them they were real. She told them they had a job. She told them in the same interior voice she'd used for 7 years. The voice that answered her body's stop with the only word that had ever worked. Not yet. Not yet. Not yet. She was 160 meters out when she heard the first one. Not the strike. Something else, a single footstep, sharp and singular from her left. She dropped instantly. Right side, rifle up, scanning. Nothing visible, 30 feet of blizzard in every direction, white on white on white. She stayed low, controlled her breathing, and listened. Footsteps. One set. Moving carefully, tactically, with the specific even spacing of someone who had training and was using it. Not a panicking garrison soldier, someone controlled. Someone hunting the first bodyguard, not the one she'd put against the fence. The one from the gate, the one she'd watched, she'd assumed, get into the vehicle with Drav. Wrong assumption. The most dangerous kind. He hadn't gone with Drav. Drad sent him back, or he'd never left, and now he was out here in the white with her, and he was good. She heard him stop, heard him listening too. The two of them in the dark and the snow, both still, both waiting for the other to commit. I can hear you, she said. Loud enough to carry, not loud enough to give position. A bluff. She couldn't hear him. A beat, then his voice, careful and controlled. How many rounds do you have left? Smart. He'd been tracking the fight. Counting her shots. Enough, she said. You've used most of them. I know the sound of a Macmillan tack suppressed. I've been counting. A pause. 3, maybe 2. And your leg is broken. I saw how you moved at the gate. She said nothing. She was shifting her weight, using his voice as a bearing, tracking him by sound. The wind was interfering, throwing his words a few degrees off true, and she couldn't be precise enough. Not for a shot she could not afford to miss. I'm not here for revenge, he said. I'm here because you're the only one who knows exactly what happened tonight. Every frequency you used. Every transmission you made. My colonel wants to know what went out and to whom. So Drav hadn't run. Not really. He'd stopped running long enough to send this man back for the one thing she carried that he couldn't replace. I can make it simple. You're not walking out of here on that leg, and the strike is in 2 minutes. You tell me what you transmitted, you hand over the transmitter clean, and I carry you out of the radius myself. You live. She thought about it for exactly the time it deserved. 3 seconds. No, she said. Then we both die in 2 minutes. You die in 2 minutes, she said. I've been moving. You've been talking. Silence. She heard him understand it. The realization arriving all at once. That while he'd been using his voice as a negotiating tool, she'd been using his voice as a locating instrument. That she'd moved during every pause. That she was no longer where she'd been when the conversation started, and he had been speaking this whole time to an empty patch of snow. He moved fast, reactive. The sound of a man who has recognized a fatal error and is trying to outrun it. She tracked the sound, left 20 feet. Going to ground, she had the angle. She took the shot. Center mass. Low. She heard him go down, heard the short, compressed sound of a trained man taking a hit and processing it. Not screaming, just cataloging. The way you learn to do when the training has gone deep enough that even being shot becomes, first, piece of information. 2 rounds left. She was on her feet and moving before he finished processing. 190 meters. She heard it before she felt it. The sound was not what most people imagine when they think about an airstrike. It was not cinematic. It was physical. A change in the way the air organized itself. A pressure event. A concussive wave that arrived from behind and drove her forward and down into the snow. She hit the ground face first. For the second time that night, the light was extraordinary, even through closed eyelids, even face down. Even with the whole blizzard between her and it, she stayed down. Counted to 10. Breathed. When she got up, firebase Vostok was gone, not damaged, not on fire, though fire was certainly involved. Gone, in the specific and absolute way of things that have been converted by ordnance, from structures into scattered material. The communications building, where Malk had watched her work, the operations center, where she'd read a map and called in a strike, the command building where she'd stood 40 minutes ago in a warmth that had nearly undone her. All of it gone. She pushed up onto her hands and knees. Her hands were starting to fail her. Not dramatically, not all at once, the slow, administrative arrival of a numbness that meant exposure. That meant a body that had been pushed past every reasonable limit and was beginning, with great courtesy, to shut down the things it could no longer afford to run. She found a flat piece of ground 30 meters further south. She reached into her vest and pulled out the signal flare. 4 deployments, never used. She'd told herself that was because she'd never needed it, which was true. But it was also because using it meant admitting you needed to be found. And Elena Rourke had spent 7 years not admitting she needed anything that someone else had to provide. Tonight was different. Tonight she set the flare, caught with a hiss and a hard orange bloom, and she sat down in the snow beside it and let her left leg exist on its own terms for the first time in hours. She reached into her breast pocket. The photograph was still there. Ruth Rourke, 1952, 24 years old, standing very straight in front of a canvas tent in a place that had spent 18 months telling her she didn't belong, not smiling eyes doing that. That thing Elena had spent her whole life trying to learn. That combination of composure and certainty her grandmother carried, as though she had looked the worst thing in the world directly in the face, and arrived at a private arrangement with it. She was starting to think she might, finally, be getting close. Somewhere 30 kilometers south, 41 people who had no idea how near the night had come to being something else entirely were finishing their watch rotations and brewing coffee and complaining about the cold. They would never know all of it. That was fine. That wasn't why she'd done it, the radio crackled. The duty officer, doing a very good job of not sounding like a man who had just watched a friendly position marker creep to the very edge of a strike radius and stay there, ghost. Strike confirmed complete. Firebase Vostok is gone. Confirmed status she picked is clear, she said. Firebase Vostok is gone. Artillery stand down confirmed prior to strike. Coalition position south are secure. A pause. One more item. Tell whoever meets the extraction bird to bring a debrief team. Full intelligence workup. Copy, ghost. Can you give me a category on what you have? She looked at the transmitter clipped to her vest. She thought about the Fort Liberty frequency glowing on a radio board inside a firebase that should never have known it existed. The details she'd filed hard hours ago with a thumbnail pressed into the page of her memory. Tell them it's bigger than one base, she said. She clipped the radio back to her vest. Hold her knees up. Well, knees singular. Her left leg had officially opted out of voluntary participation. She looked up at the sky through the blizzard and the smoke and the orange light of things that had been structures and were now only weather. 17 minutes, the duty officer had said. For the extraction bird, she had waited 11 minutes in a frozen ravine to be certain a field was clear. She had waited 4 seconds while a man she'd trusted made the worst decision of his career, and she memorized the sound of it. She could wait 17 minutes. She had, she thought, already waited long enough. The flare burned steady in the snow beside her, a small circle of orange light in an enormous dark, and the snow fell through it the way snow falls through everything. Patient, indifferent, continuous. And when the Black Hawk finally broke through the cloud ceiling and the spotlight found her, she raised one arm, just one. It was everything she had left, and it was enough. The medic who came off the bird first was a young staff sergeant named Reeves. She learned his name later, in the hospital, when she asked. Because she made a point of learning the names of the people who saw her at her worst, and treated her like she was still worth the effort. There weren't many. She kept a short list. She intended to keep his on it. Had dropped beside her in the snow with the specific urgency of a man who had seen the flare's location on a tactical display and done the math about what it meant that only one person was sitting next to it. His hands were on her immediately, the fast, professional inventory of a combat medic who has learned not to ask permission because permission takes time, and time is the one thing the wounded never have enough of to lend. When he got to the leg, he made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. The compressed, involuntary noise of a person absorbing information that is significantly worse than what he had braced for. I know, she said. Sergeant Rourke, I need you to hold still. I know, she said again, just get me on the bird. He looked at her face for 1 full second. Something passed between them. Not argument, not quite agreement, just the mutual recognition of 2 people who understood that certain conversations had already closed, and that the only thing left to do was the next thing. He got her on the bird. Flight to the field hospital took 22 minutes, and she was conscious for all of them, which she would later decide was both a gift and a very particular kind of punishment. Because conscious meant lying there with nothing to do but feel the weight of the last 6 hours arrive all at once. The way a wave arrives, not as a single blow but as a vast slow pressure that you feel building long before it reaches you and can do absolutely nothing to stop. The adrenaline was gone, the mission's math was gone. The narrow, bright tunnel of objective, next step, keep moving, gone, and what was left was just Elena Rourke. In a helicopter, broken leg, frostbitten hands, a name still filed in the back of her mind under a thumbnail pressed hard into the page, and underneath all of it, rising slowly through the dark like something surfacing from deep water, the enormous and almost unbearable recognition that she was alive. She had not been certain of that. She wanted to be clear about this later, with herself. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way of a person who had given up. She had simply been operating for 6 hours, in a place where survival was not the variable she was solving for, where she had set it aside, the way you set aside a heavy thing to do work with both hands, fully intending to pick it back up but not entirely sure the work would leave you the time. And now the work was done, and her hands were free, and she reached back for the heavy thing and found that it was, after all, still there. She was alive. Reeves was talking to her, the way medics talk to patients they're afraid of losing to shock, steady, even almost conversational, a hand on the line of consciousness keeping her from drifting off the far end of it. He asked her name. She told him. He asked her unit. She told him. He asked what had happened out there. She thought about how to answer that. Long night, she said. He gave a short exhale that was mostly a laugh and partly something else. Ma'am, he said. That is the understatement of this entire deployment. She almost smiled, almost. The field hospital at Fa B. Callahan was controlled chaos at 0509 hours. It was always some version of controlled chaos. That was the nature of the place. But word had gone ahead of her arrival, and there were more people than usual on the pad when the bird set down. A surgeon she didn't know. 2 nurses moving with the economy of people who have learned to think 3 steps ahead, and standing back from the medical cluster, not interfering, just watching with the focused patience of a man who is waiting for a conversation he intends to have the moment it becomes possible. A major from the intelligence section whose name she didn't catch. They got her inside and she lost some time after that. Not unconscious, not exactly. The dim, medicated country between full awareness and sleep, where things happen around you and to you without quite connecting to the part of you that's keeping the records. She heard words, surgery, fractures, plural. She noted that with the distant interest of someone reviewing a stranger's file. Frostbite. 2nd degree, both hands, left ear. Exposure. Blood loss, the inventory of a body that had been asked to do things bodies were not designed to do, and had done them anyway. She woke fully at 11:40 hours. She knew the time because the first thing she did was look for a clock, a reflex so deep it operated before she was properly awake. The second thing she did was try to sit up. The third thing she did was discover, in rapid and humbling succession, that her left leg was locked in a rigid external fixator from mid-thigh to ankle and that both her hands were wrapped to the point of being, in any practical sense, decorative. "Don't," said a voice. She looked left. Colonel Nora Callum, Base Commander, Joint Special Operations, was sitting in a chair 3 feet from the bed, a cup of coffee in her hand. The expression of a person who had been waiting for a while and had moved through patience into something steadier and more permanent. Something nearer to certainty. Colonel, Sergeant Rourke. Callum's voice was level and unreadable, which was either very good or very bad, and Elena had learned long ago that with commanders at Callum's altitude you did not assume. You waited for data. "How are you feeling?" "Functional." It was a lie she'd been telling so consistently for the last 12 hours that it had begun to feel less like a lie and more like a personality trait. Callum looked at her steadily. "Your surgeon used the word remarkable. I believe he meant your continued existence, not your functional status. I'll take remarkable." A pause. Callum set the coffee down on the small table beside her chair, deliberately, the way a person sets something down when they want their hands free for the next part. "Do you know what happened between 0430 and 060 this morning? 30 kilometers south of firebase Vostok?" Elena waited. "Nothing," Callum said. "Absolutely nothing happened, which is the most significant nothing in this theater in 6 months. Because what was supposed to happen, what was, by our timeline reconstruction, 45 seconds from happening, was an artillery strike on a coalition command post with 41 personnel inside it. 12 of them American, 2 of them intelligence officers who are the primary nodes of an ongoing network operation that took 18 months to build. 41. She had known there were people south. She had not known the number. She let it land, the way you let a thing land when you have learned that the only respect you can pay a number like that is to actually feel its weight, rather than filing it. 41 people. Who had woken up this morning? Who had coffee? The transmitter, Callum said. The one you pulled from the Vostok Operations Center. Our intelligence team has been working on it since 6. You told the duty officer it was bigger than one base. A beat. You were right. It isn't operational data for Vostok. It's a signals record for a coordinated network. 4 separate nodes. 14 months of traffic. Contact protocols for assets we did not know existed. Another beat. Our people are calling it the most significant single intelligence capture of the calendar year. Elena said nothing. You pulled it off a table, Callum said, in a burning operations center, with a broken leg, after being left for dead for 6 hours. Still nothing. There was nothing to say to it that wouldn't have sounded either false or small. Callum looked at her for a long moment, and then her voice changed. Not colder, but more precise. The surgeon's hands change when they stop examining a thing and start operating on it. Captain Lark filed his after-action report at 0700 this morning. Something moved in Elena's chest, not anger. Not yet. Something quieter and more controlled. The same stillness she went to before a shot, the place where everything that wasn't the next true thing fell away. He reported you as killed in action, Callum said. Ravine fall, grenade blast. He reported that extraction conditions were non-survivable, and that the decision to extract without physical confirmation of your status was a command judgment call within his authority. A pause. He was wrong on both counts. Yes, Elena said. He also reported the mission as a failure. Incomplete reconnaissance. Hostile pressure. Deteriorating conditions. Callum's voice was steady as poured concrete. He filed a failed mission report while you were sitting in the snow waiting for a helicopter. He did not know you had completed the objective. He did not know about the transmitter, or the stand down, or the strike. He filed a report that erased you, and then he went to bed. Elena looked at the ceiling. There was a water stain up there, near the corner, in the rough shape of a state she couldn't quite place. She looked at it for a moment because it was easier than looking at the colonel, and then she made herself look at the colonel because looking away was a thing the men who doubted her had always counted on. She had stopped giving people what they counted on a long time ago. How do you feel about that? Callum said. It was the kind of question Elena had not been asked in a long time. Direct. Personal. Offered with no prescribed answer attached, no right response she was supposed to locate and produce. Just the question, and the space to actually answer it. She thought about it honestly. I feel like the mission is what matters, she said finally. I feel like 41 people are alive, and a firebase is gone, and we have 14 months of enemy signals intelligence that's now in your people's hands. I feel like what Lark filed or didn't file is a separate issue from what actually happened out there. Callum looked at her for a long moment. That's a very professional answer, she said. It's the true one. It's both, Callum said, which is rarer than it should be. She picked the coffee back up. There's going to be an investigation, not optional, not discretionary. What happened last night requires a full review, and Lark's report has already created a record that contradicts the physical evidence. His own team's accounts are inconsistent. Corporal Pruitt's statement this morning contradicts 2 things in Lark's report, and he doesn't appear to realize it yet. Elena's jaw tightened very slightly. Pruitt's a good soldier. He may be, Callum said. He's also a man who left you in a ravine and is now trying to reconcile that with the fact that you saved 41 lives after he walked away. That kind of cognitive pressure produces inconsistency. A pause. Not judgment. From me. Just an observation. The door opened. A nurse, young, efficient, took one look at the conversation in progress and decided that whatever she had come in for was secondary. Colonel, Major Fenn is asking. Tell him 30 minutes, Callum said, without looking away from Elena. The nurse left. There's one more thing, Callum said, and her voice changed again, not harder, but more careful. The way a person's voice gets when they're about to say something they have spent some time deciding how to say. The investigation into the original ambush. The one that put your unit behind enemy lines in the first place. Elena waited. It was not random, Callum said. Your patrol route was filed 48 hours before the mission. Standard procedure. We have reason to believe that route was accessed by someone with authorization who is not on your team. A beat. Someone leaked the route, Elena said. We believe so. From inside the base, we believe so. The weight of that settled differently than everything else had, because the ambush, the shattered leg, the ravine. Then we go. All of it had begun in her understanding as a mission that went wrong, and missions went wrong. That was inside the framework. You trained for it. You accepted that the training might not be enough, and you went anyway, because that was the job, and the job did not come with guarantees. but a mission that went wrong because someone had sold the route. That was a different kind of weight entirely. That wasn't the randomness of combat, the cold, indifferent arithmetic of war that took people for no reason at all. That was a decision. Someone had made a decision at a desk with a pen or a keyboard, and the consequence of that decision had been a ravine and a broken leg and a team that walked away and 41 people who had come within 45 seconds of dying on a Christmas morning. Who, she said. It wasn't really a question. It was the sound of a person orienting herself. We don't know yet, Callum said. We have candidates. The investigation's active. A pause. I'm telling you because you have a right to know, and because some of what's on that transmitter you brought back appears to corroborate the leaked timeline. Our people flagged it this morning. The signals record includes a transmission on a frequency we use internally, 44 hours before your mission, originating from inside this base's communication radius. Elena's hands tightened inside their wrappings. She felt it even through the bandages, the involuntary physical response to a fact her brain was still organizing. Someone here, someone with access, someone who had filed the route and then filed something else, somewhere else, on a channel that should only ever have talked to itself. And then watched a patrol walk out into the dark knowing exactly what was waiting for it. I want to be part of the investigation, she said. I know. When I'm medically cleared, Sergeant. Callum's voice was firm but not unkind. When you are medically cleared, which is not today and is not tomorrow, and which will require you to actually cooperate with your treatment rather than continuing to describe your condition as functional. When it is, in fact, significantly more complicated than that. She raised an eyebrow over the rim of her coffee. Are we clear? Elena looked at her hands. At the IV line in her arm. Clear, she said. Callum stood. She was taller than Elena had registered from a horizontal position, a solid, composed presence with the kind of authority that did not require announcement. She picked up her coffee and started toward the door, then stopped. One more thing, she said, not turning around. Lark's report listed the mission as a failure. A pause. I've already submitted a corrected after action to Theater Command. The mission is being reclassified as a success, full intelligence capture, hostile strike prevention. Your name is on the report, she finally turned. Just slightly, just enough, so is your call sign. Ghost, she left, and Elena lay in the hospital bed and looked at the water stain shaped like a state she couldn't name, and let all of it land, the 41, the network, the leaked route, the corrected report with her name on it. And underneath all of it, quietest and heaviest, the single fact that someone she would soon be able to name had decided, at a desk, that her life and the lives of 41 strangers were an acceptable price for whatever they'd been paid. Major Tobias Fenn arrived 30 minutes later. He was the man who had been standing back from the medical cluster on the pad. She recognized him now, in the daylight, and recognized something else about him too immediately, because it was a thing she did herself. He had the look of a man who had learned to make himself appear less sharp than he was, slightly rumpled, mild. The kind of face you'd forget in a briefing and fail to notice was the only person in the room who had understood the whole thing. He sat down, put a tablet on the tray table beside her bed, turned it to face her. On the screen was a signals map. Nodes and connections, lines of communication rendered in the particular aesthetic of intelligence analysis. The visual language of an organization trying to take something built specifically to be invisible and force it to be seen. She had seen maps like it in briefings. This one was larger than any she'd seen in a briefing. You recognize this, he said. Network map, 14 months of signals, Fenn said. 4 active nodes, 32 identified contacts. He pulled up a second screen, a frequency log, columns of timestamps marching back across the better part of a year. There's one transmission in here that stands out. It originates from inside Fort Liberty's communication radius. 44 hours before your mission. He looked at her. The frequency is internal, coalition only. It should not appear in an enemy signals record at all. A pause. It's the same frequency you saw active on the radio board inside Vostok's communications building. At 0108, Elena went very still because she remembered it, the small detail, thing she'd filed, hard, with a thumbnail pressed into the page of her memory, in the half-second before she'd reached for the door of the communications shack. The Fort Liberty frequency, glowing on an enemy board, in the middle of the night, inside a firebase that should never in any version of the world have known that channel existed. She had carried that detail through 6 hours of a burning base. Through a broken leg and a kicked leg and a hunt in the snow. Through an extraction and a surgery and a stranger's water stain on a ceiling and it had just become the single most important thing she had seen all night. "It's not a base," Fen said. "It's a person." Elena waited. "Someone embedded," he said. "Someone with deep access. Someone whose communication signature appears twice in the record." He held up 2 fingers, set them down. Once, 14 months ago, when the network was being established, and once, 44 hours before your mission was ambushed, the pre-shot stillness came over her again. The world narrowing to a single point. The place where there was only the next true thing and everything else fell away. "Same person," she said. "Same frequency signature," he said carefully. "We're still verifying. But yes, we believe the person who helped establish this network is the same person who transmitted your patrol route. You have a name." It was not a question this time either. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the ward she could hear the ordinary texture of the base. Generators, voices, the distant grind of a vehicle, all the unremarkable noise of a place that did not know how close last night had come to being a catastrophe. "We have a name," he said, "and I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is going to be very difficult to hear. 7 years, that was what moved through her, in the space between his sentences. 7 years of being told she couldn't handle things, couldn't take it, needed to be protected from information her male counterparts received without caveat or preamble or a gentle hand laid first on the table. 7 years of sitting in exactly this kind of moment and having to demonstrate, every single time, she was present and capable and entitled to the full and undiluted truth. "Tell me," she said. He turned the tablet over. Taped to the back of the case was a piece of paper. Old school. Analog. Nothing digital, nothing that could be screenshot, nothing that could be transmitted on any frequency by anyone ever. A name written in block letters by hand. He held it up. She read it. 2 words. Simple as a headstone, Gideon Lark. The room was very quiet. She read it again. 4 years. She had known this man for 4 years, trained with him, served under him, eaten beside him in a dozen mess halls, planned beside him over a dozen maps, trusted him in the specific, limited, professional way you trust people in this world, with operational details and her own life on more occasions than she could readily count. She had stood up in a briefing room early in her second deployment when a senior NCO had questioned his judgment, and she had said, with her whole chest, that Lark was solid, Lark was reliable. Lark was the kind of officer you wanted making decisions when the decisions were hard. She had believed every word of it, and he had been, even then. She did the math without wanting to, the dates assembling themselves against her will. He had been, even then, 11 days into building a thing that would one day put her in a ravine. She looked up at Fen. "The investigation is 3 days old," he said. "We had circumstantial evidence before your transmitter. Now we have signals confirmation. We move when we have physical corroboration, which we expect within 72 hours. Does he know?" Fen's expression shifted barely, but she caught it. "Lark is currently being interviewed." As a witness, a pause. "His interview began this morning. We're treating everyone on your team as a witness at this stage." She looked at the name one more time. "I want to be in the room when you move," she said. "Sergeant Rourke." "I want to be in the room." Her voice was level, completely level, and she was aware distantly that her ability to keep it level in this particular moment was either the healthiest or the least healthy thing about her, and that she did not currently have the resource to determine which. "I'm not asking to conduct the arrest. I'm not asking for access to the interrogation. I'm asking to be present when you make the move, so that the person who was sold out by this individual is standing there when the account is settled." She held his gaze. "I think I've earned that." Fen looked at her, at the fixator, at the bandaged hands, the face of a woman who had been left for dead 9 hours ago and was now lying in a hospital bed, discussing the timeline of a counterintelligence operation with the same flat, complete focus she'd used to work her way through a burning firebase in a blizzard. Took the piece of paper off the back of the tablet, folded it twice, set it on her tray table beside the cup of water she hadn't touched. 72 hours, he said. "If your surgeon clears you for mobility, even limited, you're in the room." He stood, gathered the tablet, and left. Elena picked up the folded paper, held it. She did not open it again. She didn't need to. The name was already in her, the way everything from last night was in her. Filed, present, permanent, thumbnail pressed so hard into the page it had gone all the way through. She set the paper down. She looked at the water stain on the ceiling. And for a little while, she let herself feel the thing she had not allowed herself to feel since the ravine. Not the anger. The anger was easy. The anger was almost a relief. The other thing, the harder thing, the specific grief of learning that a piece of the framework you had built your trust on, A peace you had defended out loud, a peace you had been proud of trusting, had never been load-bearing at all, had in fact been quietly cutting through your supports for 4 years, with a patience and a precision she could almost have admired if it had belonged to anyone else. Then she put it down to 72 hours. She had a deadline, deadlines she could work with. She pressed the call button for the nurse. When the woman appeared in the doorway, Elena said, "I need to talk to my surgeon. I need to know exactly what I have to do to be on my feet in 3 days." The nurse looked at the leg, then at her face. And then she did the calculation that everyone who spent any time around Elena Rourke eventually did. The calculation where you weigh what you're looking at against what you're hearing, and decide which one is the more accurate description of who this person actually is. "I'll get him," the nurse said. 72 hours is a long time when you are lying in a hospital bed with a broken leg and 2 bandaged hands and a name in block letters sitting on your tray table. It is also, as it turns out, exactly enough time to make a surgeon revise his professional opinion. Captain Aldridge came to her on the morning of day 3, with her chart in one hand, and the expression of a man who had been asked an unreasonable question, and had spent 72 hours discovering, against his every instinct, that the answer might be yes. "Your bone density is unusual," he said. "I don't mean that as a compliment or a criticism. I mean it as a clinical observation. Your fracture stabilization is ahead of where I projected. Considerably ahead. Does that mean I can stand?" "It means," he said carefully, "that with the external fixator, with a crutch, with someone beside you in case you go down, and with the explicit understanding that you are not under any interpretation cleared for field activity, you can stand. For a short time." In a controlled environment, he looked at her. "Why do I have the distinct feeling that stand in a room is not the whole truth?" "It's the whole truth," she said. "I need to stand in a room and be present for something. That's all." He held her gaze for a moment. 1 hour, he said. "A crutch, someone with you. If your pain crosses a 7, you sit down, and you tell that someone immediately." He paused. "And Sergeant Rourke, if I find out that stand in a room was a significant underrepresentation of what actually happened in that room, I will personally ensure that your next 72 hours are the least comfortable of your recovery." "Are we clear?" "Understood," she said. He left. She was already reaching for the crutch before the door finished closing. Fenn was in the corridor. He'd been there since before she woke, she suspected. The particular punctuality of a man who has decided that a morning is important and is leaving nothing to chance. He looked at her on the crutch, took in the fixator, and did the same calculation the nurse had done 3 days ago, and the medic before her, and the technical officer in a firebase that no longer existed. "You're sure?" he said. "Don't," she said. He didn't. He fell in beside her, and they walked. The room was not dramatic. That was the first thing she registered when Fenn opened the door. A kind of quiet surprise, because some part of her had built it up into something with more gravity, more architecture, and instead it was just a standard briefing room. A table, chairs, a whiteboard with nothing written on it. 2 military police standing against the far wall, with the neutral, deliberately uninteresting expression of people who have been told to be present and to take up as little space as a human being can. Colonel Callum was there, standing at the head of the table, her coffee in hand, that same contained certainty she'd carried into the hospital room 3 days ago. And sitting at the table, his hands flat on the surface, his eyes tracking her entry with an expression she had never seen on his face in 4 years of serving beside him, was Captain Gideon Lark, not lieutenant anymore. He'd been field promoted 8 months ago. She had attended that ceremony. She had stood in the second row and watched them pin it on him, and afterward she had shaken his hand and meant it. She stopped in the doorway. The room was very quiet. "Sergeant Rourke," Callum said. Her voice was level, precise, the voice of a person who had chosen composure and was holding it without apparent effort. "Take a seat." Elena didn't sit. She looked at Lark. He looked back at her. She watched him do the thing people do when they have been caught. That rapid interior negotiation, where they are still calculating whether any version of the story works in their favor, whether any play remains on the board, whether the person standing across from them knows everything or only some things. He read her face, and then he stopped negotiating. "Elena." "Don't," she said. Her voice was flat. Completely flat. "Don't use my first name. Don't do the version where you look at me like I'm something you can still manage." She moved to the table. Not sitting. Standing on the crutch, her weight distributed the way she had practiced through 3 painful mornings of physical therapy specifically, so that she could do exactly this. Stand in this room, on her own, under her own power, and not give him the satisfaction of watching her need to sit. You filed a KIA report on me, she said. Lark's jaw tightened. The conditions were you filed a KIA report on me while I was alive. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. While I was inside that firebase, calling in coordinates that saved 41 people. While I was doing the mission you walked away from. A pause. And that is the least of what this room is about. Fenn sat down and opened his tablet. His voice, when he spoke, steady and procedural. The voice of a man who had done this before and understood that the most destabilizing thing he could possibly do in a room like this was remain completely, unbreakably calm. Captain Lark. We're going to go through the signals record. You'll have an opportunity to respond to each item. Everything you say is being recorded. He looked at Lark. We have your communication signature on 14 months of enemy network traffic. The first instance is day 11 of your current deployment. The most recent instance is 44 hours before Sergeant Rourke's mission was ambushed. He set the tablet down. I'd like you to explain the first instance. Silence. It lasted 10 seconds. Elena counted them. Counting was still what she had. I want a lawyer, Lark said. You have the right to request JEG counsel, Callum said immediately. That request is documented and will be fulfilled. You are not being questioned under duress, and you may terminate this session at any time. A pause. I want you to understand, Captain, the signal's evidence is physical and independently verified. JAG counsel will tell you exactly what I'm telling you now, that the question before you is not whether this happened. It is what you say about why. Lark looked at his hands. Elena watched him. She was looking for the thing she'd been looking for since Fenn held up that piece of paper, the thing that would make it make sense. 4 years, she'd trusted him with operational details. She'd defended him in a briefing room. She was looking for the reason, for the specific weight that had been set on one side of a scale heavy enough to make the other side, the side with 41 lives and a sniper in a ravine, light enough to accept. How much, she said. Lark looked up. How much did they pay you? The room was completely still. Lark looked at her for a long moment, and she watched it happen, the decision, not the decision to confess, not the decision to explain. The decision, simpler and sadder than either, to stop performing. The particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding a version of himself in place for a very long time, with both hands against a steady pressure, and has just in this room in front of these people run entirely out of the strength to keep holding it. It wasn't about the money, he said. Then what? It was about getting out. His voice was tight, controlled, but with something raw underneath it now, something that had been sealed up for a long time, not running. Getting out from under a mission that was going to get all of us killed. The intel was bad. I told command the intel was bad for 3 months. I flagged it. I wrote it up. I put my name on report after report saying the sourcing was compromised, and nobody listened, and they kept sending us out anyway. Elena said nothing. She thought distantly of her own 3 reports. Filed. No response. She put the thought down before it could become a thing she felt. They were going to keep sending us out, Lark said, till they had their confirmation. And the confirmation was going to come in the form of body bags. That was the plan. That was always the plan, even if nobody would write it down. So, he stopped, swallowed. So I sold a route, one route, not the team. I thought, you thought what? She said. I thought they'd hit us hard enough to abort the mission without casualties. A contact, a scare, enough that command would finally have to accept the sourcing was compromised and stand the whole operation down. I thought I was stopped again. The silence that followed accumulated weight the longer it went on. Corporal Torres lost his left hand, Elena said. Lark said nothing. 3 of us were medivist. Torres lost his hand, and you filed me dead. She let it sit. You didn't leave me because the conditions were non-survivable. You left me because a dead ghost was a closed file. And a living ghost was a problem you couldn't afford. Because whatever I might find inside that firebase, whatever I might bring back, something you needed to be buried in a ravine. Lark's face was very still. That's exactly what happened. She held his gaze, and she gave him nothing to push against. No heat, no tremor. Just the flat, clear certainty of a fact, stated by someone who had no remaining doubt about it. And she watched him understand that there was nowhere for the sentence to go. That she had said the true thing was simply going to sit there in the room with all of them now, permanent, unanswerable. Then Fenn spoke, and his voice, which had been steady and procedural, deliberately uninteresting, changed by exactly 1 degree, enough to make everyone in the room turn toward him. There's one additional item, Captain. He turned the tablet to face Lark. On the screen was a personnel file, cross-referenced, recommendations, promotion track requests, reassignment orders, documented sequence of administrative actions spanning 4 years, each one on its own minor and unremarkable, a single signature on a single form. Collectively, a pattern with a shape as clear and deliberate as the choke point at grid 447-229. In the course of this investigation, Finn said, "We reviewed your personnel actions regarding Sergeant Rourke, going back to her first deployment under your command. 3 promotion track recommendations blocked at the administrative level. 2 reassignment orders, approved by theater command and then quietly suspended." He tapped the screen once, each one blocked or suspended by a single signature. "Yours." The room was very still. Elena looked at the screen. She had suspected pieces of this. The track that was suggested and then dropped. The team lead slot she'd been next in line for, twice, that had somehow never materialized. Every time she'd been told the timing wasn't right, the slot wasn't available, the unit needed her where she was. She had suspected pieces. She had not seen the whole shape of it until right now. He had not just sold a route. He had spent 4 years building a box around her future, one signature at a time, and calling it her job. She was getting reassigned anyway. The sentence in the snow, the careless thing she was never meant to hear, the small cold animal that had shown her its face. It had been true. There had been an order. He had processed it, and then he had killed it, the way he had killed all the others. Because a ghost with her own team was a ghost he couldn't keep close. And a ghost he couldn't keep close was as a ghost who might, one day, find something he needed buried. She breathed through it the way she breathed through pain, pressing it, acknowledging it, filing it, deciding, with great care, exactly what she was going to do with it, which was stand here and let it be true in front of witnesses, and not give it 1 inch more of her than that. And then Fenn reached into the folder beside him and produced one more document. He set it on the table in front of Elena. "There's something else you should see," he said. She looked down at the page. It was a supplemental report. Filed 3 days ago. Time stamped 412 hours. Less than 2 hours after she'd been pulled off the snow. Filed by a soldier who had been on the extraction bird. A soldier who had come back to Phobe Callahan, and instead of sleeping, instead of decompressing, instead of doing any of the things a man does after the worst night of his deployment, had sat down and written 11 pages that contradicted, point by point, almost everything in Lark's after-action report, filed voluntarily, without being asked, without knowing she was alive to ever need it. The name at the top of the report was Corporal Seth Pruitt. Elena read the first paragraph, then the second. She stopped, and she looked away from the page. For exactly 1 second, just one. The only time, 3 days. The only time in this entire long story, from the moment the grenade left the ridgeline to the moment she stood in this quiet room on a crutch, that she had needed to look away from anything at all, because Pruitt had not done it for her. He couldn't have. He had thought she was dead. He had sat down in the dark believing, with no reason to believe otherwise, that he was writing a report that would go into a file that a dead woman would never read, in service of a truth the dead woman would never know had been told on her behalf. He had done it because he could not live with the alternative, because the training goes only so far. Because orders and pressure and rank and authority can move a man's feet, can make him turn and walk 14 steps into a storm against everything his gut is screaming. But they cannot, in the end, move a man's conscience, if that conscience is still alive in him. Because Seth Pruitt had walked away from a ravine on Christmas Eve, following an order he had not been able to refuse, and had spent the next 90 minutes on a helicopter trying to make his peace with what he had done, and had failed, and had landed, and not slept, and done the only thing left in the world that he could do. He had written the truth for nobody for her. Elena folded the report, carefully with her bandaged hands, put it in the breast pocket of the hospital robe, said nothing about it, because there was nothing she could have said that would not have been smaller than the thing itself. Column spoke, and her voice had the quality of a door closing. Captain Mark. JAG Council is being contacted. This session is suspended pending their arrival. You will remain in this facility. She looked at the 2 military police against the wall, and they moved forward with the quiet efficiency of people executing a decision that had already fully been made. Lark stood. He looked at Elena one more time. And she understood, in the way he looked at her, that he was searching her face for something. Some last sign that anything he had been to her, any of the 4 years still registered, still had the power to land. A flinch. A flicker. Some evidence that he could still, even now, even here, manage her. She gave him nothing. Not anger. Not contempt. Not the satisfaction of seeing that anything he found in her face still mattered to him. She gave him the same flat, present, clear-eyed attention she gave a target in her scope. Completely there, completely beyond his reach. They took him out of the room, the door closed, and the thing she had been holding at arm's length for 3 days, the thing she had managed by staying focused on the investigation, on mobility, on the surgeon's criteria, on the next immediate objective, arrived finally all at once, not grief exactly, not betrayal in the simple sense, something more complex and more permanent. The specific loss of a piece of the framework you'd built your trust on, piece you hadn't known was load-bearing until the moment it wasn't there. Colum moved to stand beside her. She didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there, present, not filling the space, which Elena recognized as a deliberate kindness and a rare one. Choice to be there without making the being there about yourself. You okay? Callum said finally. Working on it, fair answer. 3 weeks later. Phoebe Callahan, 1400 hours, the fixator was gone. The crutch was gone. She walked with a slight favoring of the left leg that the physical therapist said would fully resolve within 6 months. A small unevenness in her gait, hitch you'd only notice if you were looking, and most people weren't looking. Her hands were functional, the frostbite healed, the sensations back to baseline. She had been cleared for limited duty 2 days ago, and Aldridge had looked at her chart one final time and said, with genuine bewilderment in his voice, remarkable. I keep using that word and I keep meaning it. She was in Callum's office when it happened, not a briefing. She'd been called in informally, which was either good or indicated something she hadn't anticipated, and she had been doing this job long enough to know that informal meetings in a base commander's office were rarely, in any real sense, informal. Callum was standing behind her desk. Fenn was there, and a third person she had not expected, Brigadier General Warren Holt, theater commander. A man whose name she knew from orders and from the chain of command that existed above her daily operational life, the way weather exists above a city, present, powerful, and usually entirely abstract. He was not abstract right now. He was standing in this office, looking at her with the focused attention of a person who has reviewed a file very thoroughly and is now comparing the file to the human being in front of him, checking the match. Sergeant Rourke. He said, "Sit down." She sat. He sat. Callum and Fenn remained standing, which told her something about the topology of the meeting, before anyone said another word. "I've read the full after-action," Holt said, the corrected version. "The intelligence assessment of the transmitter data, the investigation findings on Lark." He folded his hands on the desk. "I've also read 6 years of your personnel file, your qualification records, your commander's assessments going back to your first deployment." Elena said nothing. "Your first deployment commander wrote," and I'm quoting directly, "Sergeant Rourke demonstrates tactical instincts that are genuinely unusual, and an ability to operate under extreme stress that I have not observed at this level in this context." Holt looked at her steadily. "He recommended you for a specialized reconnaissance track. He noted that you should be considered for team leadership within 18 months. A pause. "That was 6 years ago. You were not given the track. You were not given the team leadership consideration. You continued as a specialist asset within a line unit." He let it sit. "Do you know why?" "I have a theory," she said. "So do I," he said, "and the investigation findings support it. Lark's communications with the enemy network include references to a managed unit structure." His words. "Our analysts believe he was deliberately suppressing personnel actions that would have moved you out of his direct authority. He let that land. He needed you subordinate. A ghost with her own team was a ghost he couldn't use. The room was quiet architecture. Someone had built a box around her career, one signature at a time, and called it a road, and told her the lines were for her own good. "What happens now?" she said. Holt reached into the full folder in front of him and produced a single sheet of paper. He turned it to face her and slid it across the desk. She read it, a promotion order. "Sergeant to Sergeant First Class. Effective immediately, with a notation of acceleration citing exceptional operational conduct. Attached to it, a second document, a unit activation order. Joint Special Operations Command Task Force Ghost 6 billets. 1 team lead slot." Her name was typed in the team lead line. She read it twice. "The task force activation is contingent on your full medical clearance," Holt said, "which your surgeon projects at 8 weeks. Team selection is yours. You'll have access to the full personnel roster for the theater, and you may request anyone not currently assigned to an active operation." A pause. "The mission profile is reconnaissance and direct action against the remaining nodes of the network identified on your transmitter. You know the intelligence is better than anyone alive. You built the foundation of this operation." He looked at her. I want you to finish it. She looked at the activation order, at the team lead line, at her name in that space, typed in standard military font, ordinary looking, entirely unremarkable, and completely extraordinary. She thought about every room she had ever walked into, where the assumption had been that she was in the wrong room, every range score that had been double-checked, every recommendation filed and quietly lost, every time she'd been told, in language that ranged from the explicit to the architectural, that the space she was trying to occupy had not been designed for her. She thought about a ravine in a blizzard, and a voice saying, "Then we go," and the decision she'd made in the silence after 14 footsteps faded, not the decision to survive, the decision to complete the objective. Not because anyone was watching, not because there was any guarantee that anyone would ever know, but because the mission was the mission, and she was the only one left to run it. Yes, she said, not elaborated, not qualified, just yes. Clean and direct and final, the way she made every decision that mattered. Holt nodded once. Callum picked up her coffee. Ben was already on his tablet, beginning whatever came next. Elena folded the activation order, put it in her left breast pocket, the same pocket as the photograph. She stepped out of the office into the corridor and found a quiet corner near a window that looked out over the base. The sky over Fob Callahan was the particular gray of a sky that hasn't yet decided what it wants to be. Not threatening, not clear, just holding, the way a held breath holds. She pulled out her phone, dialed. It rang twice, Elena, Ruth Rourke's voice. 76 years old and still the clearest sound she knew. "Hey, Grandma?" A pause. Specific pause of a woman who has spent 76 years learning to read silences and who can hear, in a single spoken name, that her granddaughter has been somewhere and come back changed. "Mission's done?" Elena said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Which one?" Elena looked out the window, at the gray sky. At the base below, ordinary and occupied, going about the serious daily business of people who had decided that certain things were worth protecting and had organized their whole lives around the protecting of them. She thought about 41 people who had eaten breakfast that morning without knowing why they were still alive to eat it. She thought about Seth Pruitt, writing 11 pages in the dark for a dead woman who wasn't dead. She thought about a transmitter full of 14 months of evidence in an intelligence office somewhere in this building, and 4 nodes on a map, and 6 billets waiting to be filled by 6 people she had not yet chosen. She thought about the activation order, folded against her chest, beside a photograph from 1952. The first one, she said. Ruth made a sound that was mostly an exhale and partly something else. Something that had been waiting 11 years to come out and was only now, quietly, allowing itself. "Come home whole." Elena looked down at her left leg, at the slight favoring that would resolve in 6 months and that she had already privately decided to keep, not the limp itself but what it stood for. At her hands, functional again, wrapped around a phone instead of a rifle for once in their lives. "Working on it, Grandma," she said. Working on it, she put the phone away, and she pressed her palm flat against her chest for exactly 1 second, felt the small stiffness of the photograph through the fabric, and the activation order beside it. The anchor and the line, both there, both holding. Then she straightened up, and she walked down the corridor, with the slight favoring of the left leg that would resolve in 6 months, and that she had decided to keep, not as a reminder of the pain, but of the decision. The decision made in the silence after 14 footsteps walked away. Because the mission doesn't end just because someone decides it's inconvenient. Because a woman named Ruth Rourke had written 7 words on the back of a photograph in 1952, and every choice her granddaughter had made since she was old enough to understand them had been in the end in service of what those 7 words actually meant. Until Task Force Ghost had 6 billets and 4 nodes and a network that had spent 14 months believing it was invisible. And it was about to learn what Alexei Drav had already learned, in the firelight with a stand-down order in his own mouth. What Pyotr Melk had understood the moment she walked through his door. What Gideon Lark was, at this very hour, sitting in a cell being forced, finally to reckon with, that the most dangerous thing a person can do, in any weather, on any ground, in any war, is to look at Elena Rourke and decide that she is already finished. She walked like she knew exactly where she was going, because she did.